Three grown children sat down in a lawyer's office expecting to hear their mother's will. Instead, the lawyer placed an old tape recorder on the table and pressed play. Their mother's voice filled the room. She had been dead for 3 days. Then the lawyer asked one question. Do any of you know when she recorded this? None of them did, because this wasn't a deathbed message. It had been waiting for them for 11 years. Eleanor Hartley was 78 when she died, in her own bed, in a small town in Ohio. In the last decade of her life, her own children described her, in writing, in emails to each other, in a petition filed with the county court, as confused, as declining, as a burden. One of them had used a different word, years earlier, at a funeral reception, when he thought the door beside him was closed. He said she was worthless. He said she was a line item, and they should treat her like one. He didn't know she was standing 4 feet away. He didn't know she was recording. And he had no idea that the factory with his family's name on the sign had never, at any point in its history, belonged to his father. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 9 tapes. That's what was in that office. 9 recordings, made over 11 years by a woman a physician had formally declared unfit to run her own life. So the questions aren't simple. What does a woman do with 11 years and a secret? Why keep recording, month after month, for a decade, when nobody is listening? Why, when she had all 3 of them cold, did she sit in a chair and let it happen to her? And what did she ask for on that tape, on the day she made it, that not one of her 3 children ever gave her? It starts in a hallway, not with a crime, with a woman standing on the wrong side of a door. Her husband Ray had died on a Tuesday, in the parking lot of his own plant, walking to his truck at the end of a shift. Stroke. He was gone before the ambulance cleared the county line. The reception was at a funeral home on 3rd Street, one of those places with the good carpet and the bad coffee and a sliding partition between the viewing room and the family room. If you've ever been in a room like that, you already know what I'm about to tell you. That partition stops sight. It does not stop sound. And Eleanor, 67 years old, for hours after burying her husband, had stepped into the side hallway by the coat rack because she needed 90 seconds where nobody was holding her arm and telling her he was in a better place. She had her purse with her, and in that purse was a tape recorder because she'd been handling the estate paperwork all week, and because her hands had started to shake, and because she was too proud to ask anyone to take notes for her. She'd carried it to the funeral home, the bank, the insurance office. She'd used it that morning to write down what the director said about the headstone, and she had forgotten to shut it off. So it was running. A woman in a black dress, holding a purse, 4 feet from that partition, with a tape rolling inside it, when her 3 children started talking about what to do with her. The recording is 31 seconds. Underneath everything you can hear a coffee urn working. You hear Diane say something about the house. Then you hear Richard Hartley, 43 years old, clear his throat. "We need to be realistic about Mom," he says. Diane says his name, just his name, that tone every family knows, the one that means don't. And Richard says, "No, I'm not being cruel. I'm being honest. She was never part of this. Dad carried her for 40 years. She did the checkbook. That's it." And then, after a pause you can hear, "She's a line item. Let's just treat her like a line item." Nobody argued. That's the part. Not Richard, saying a small thing badly on the worst day of his life. It's the silence after it. Because Diane was standing right there, and Diane was the one person in that building who knew better, and Diane let it stand. Curtis was out in the parking lot and never heard a word. And on the other side of that partition, Eleanor didn't move. She went back into the room. She shook 40 hands. She accepted 40 condolences about what a great man Ray had been, and she drove herself home. Here's the part nobody believes. She didn't confront them. Not that night. Not ever. She sat down at her kitchen table at 10 o'clock, played the tape once more, and got out a legal pad. Because Richard had made one mistake in that 31 seconds, and it wasn't cruelty. It was a fact. He said his father carried her. And there was a document at the county courthouse, older than every person in that building, that made the sentence he'd just said impossible. Her father was a soybean farmer named Walter Boyd. 22 acres of flat ground outside town that nobody thought much of. Before she married Ray, Walter deeded that land to his daughter. Not to the couple, to Eleanor. Her name alone. He was old-fashioned in a way that turned out to be almost prophetic, and he gave her a reason she'd repeat to a lawyer half a century later. Land is the only thing a man can't talk you out of. 3 years after the wedding, Ray built a factory on it. Hartley Fastener and Tool. It grew into 96 employees making precision fasteners for the automotive supply chain and a sign out front you could read from the highway. And Ray never transferred the ground. There's no document. 3 lawyers went looking later. It almost certainly wasn't strategy. It was a man in a hurry with a bulldozer already scheduled, and it was his wife's land. And what's the difference? It's all the same pile. He never got around to it. And nobody checked for 42 years, because why would you check? It's the dirt. It's just there. So when Richard said his father carried her, he was standing in a building his mother owned the ground under. He just didn't know it. Neither did she yet. Not the way she was about to. Understand who she actually was. She never went to college. She took a job at the bank on Main Street, and by 19 she was running the loan desk in everything but title, and that's where a tool and die man walked in one afternoon asking for $11,000 he had no business getting. Eleanor Boyd didn't help him with his application. She rewrote it, found the flaw in his repayment schedule, and argued it through her manager herself. He got the loan. 14 months later, he married her. For the next 4 decades, she did the books, negotiated every supply contract, caught the pricing error that would have sunk the company, and designed the die modification that made it real money for 20 years. When that patent was filed, the name on it was Raymond J. Hartley. She never said one word about it. Not in 38 years. 3 weeks after the funeral, she climbed a flight of stairs to an office above a hardware store and hired a man named Thomas Grady. He did wills, easements, and property line arguments between farmers. He wore the same 3 ties for 20 years and talked slowly enough that people assumed he wasn't listening, which was the most expensive mistake anyone could make about him. His calendar said estate matters. He figured 40 minutes. She was there 4 hours. And she opened with a question, he said. Years later, nobody had ever asked him in that form before or since. She put her hands flat on the table and said, "What do I own that they don't know I own?" He pulled the records. And there it was. Walter Boyd to Eleanor Boyd. Never transferred. Never sold. Which meant the buildings, the loading dock, the rail spur, 96 jobs, $11 million a year. The whole monument to Ray Hartley's name was standing on ground that belonged to the woman her son had just called a line item. Every brick of it, standing on her. Watch what she does with that. Because a different woman burns the house down that afternoon. Grady put the 22 acres into a company and named it after her father. A name that meant nothing to anybody in that family. Then he did the thing that took 10 years to detonate. He drafted a lease. If your business sits on somebody else's ground, you pay them rent. That's all it is. $4,200 a month, mailed to the plant in a plain envelope with a 1-page letter calling it a renewal. There was nothing to renew. There never had been. But Richard had been running that company for 6 weeks. His father had died with no succession plan, 41 open orders, and a bank that wanted a conversation. He was drowning. And a piece of paper showed up that looked like every other piece of paper on his desk, for a number that against $11 million in revenue is less than the coffee service and the lawn care combined. He signed it without reading it. Every quarter for the next 10 years, a check went out of that plant to his mother, folded the same way, in the same envelope, initialed on the same line of the same report he reviewed himself. 40 quarters. He never once saw it. And she never touched a dollar of it. It piled up in an account while the whole town of Millbrook, Ohio quietly agreed that poor Eleanor was slipping. So she had him. 3 weeks after her husband's funeral, she had every one of them, completely. And she did nothing. For 11 years. That's the real mystery in this story, and it isn't the money. Hold that. Because what happened next was that she started to lose her mind. Genuinely. Not as a strategy. It started small. She'd call Diane and ask the same question she'd asked the day before. She missed a dentist appointment, then 2 more. Her mail went into a laundry basket by the door instead of getting opened. At Thanksgiving, she called Curtis's ex-wife by the wrong name. Twice. And Diane looked across the table at Richard, and something passed between them that neither of them said out loud. She wrote checks and voided them. She backed into a mailbox at the end of her own driveway. She left a burner ticking under an empty kettle for an hour and a half. And Richard started a folder. Labeled in marker, MOM, documentation. 41 pages. Dates, times, descriptions. Every confused phone call. Every missed appointment. Logged like a maintenance record on a machine that was starting to fail. And here's the thing that makes this story sit sideways in your chest. That is exactly what a responsible man does when he's frightened for his mother. It is also, to the page, exactly what you'd build if you were preparing a petition. Those two things look identical from the outside. I don't think Richard could have told you which one he was doing. I'm not sure he ever knew. Because he wasn't wrong. That's what nobody wants to hear. He was right about the burner. He was right about the mailbox. He drove out there at 11 at night twice because she'd called him at 9 and forgotten. He was right about almost every individual fact in that folder. He was catastrophically wrong about exactly one thing, and it wasn't on the list. Diane, though? Diane made a choice, and it was hers alone. There was an afternoon, about a year before the petition, when Eleanor asked her to sit down at the kitchen table. She had a folder of her own, and it was organized, and she'd been waiting for the right day. She said there was something Diane needed to understand about the ground under the plant. She got about 2 sentences in, and Diane, who was as sharp as her mother, who could have followed every word of it, looked at her watch and said, "Mom, not now." She put the folder back on the counter herself. She let herself out. That was the last time Eleanor Hartley tried to tell anybody. Diane didn't misunderstand her mother. She declined to. Richard took her to a physician for what he told her was a routine checkup. 30 questions. What year is it? What season? Count backward from 100 by sevens. She scored 18. 18 out of 30 is not a gray area. It's the number that ends conversations and gets signatures onto court documents. 3 months later, Richard and Diane went to court to have their mother declared incapable of running her own life. Nobody told Curtis. And she didn't fight it. Sit with that. She hired no one. She objected to nothing. She sat in a courtroom in a blue cardigan with her purse in her lap and let a judge ask her, gently, what year it was. And she got it wrong. And they handed her son the keys to her whole life. Her money, her house, her doctors, her mail. Which is the exact moment this story should die. Because now he could see everything she owned. Except her name wasn't on it. Not anywhere he'd think to look. The company was in her father's name. The mail went to an office above a hardware store, and the money sat with Grady. So when Richard opened the drawer marked Mom, he found a house, a Buick, and $11,000 at the same bank where she'd once run the loan desk. And here's the thing about a man like Richard, and maybe about all of us. He wasn't looking for what she had. He was looking for proof that she was finished. He found that everywhere. So he stopped looking. She lived the rest of her life in her own house on $400 a month, with an aide 3 days a week. He sold her car. And every one of those days, there was a key under a flower pot on the back porch that had been there for 16 years, for a son who'd been banned from that property for stealing from the register. Nobody in that family knew it was there. Nobody knocked. Then came the 8th tape. There's one other voice on it. Richard is in her kitchen with his phone on speaker, talking to a broker out of Columbus because a logistics developer had started sniffing around the parcel. Flat, cleared, rail access, for minutes off the interstate. Exactly the kind of ground that quietly became worth a fortune while nobody was paying attention. And on that tape you can hear Richard Hartley read the lease. Actually read it. For the first time, 10 years after signing it. You hear him go quiet. Then, hang on. Hang on. Who owns the dirt? The broker says something. Richard says, no? No, that got handled. Dad handled that. That was handled before I was born. Then 40 seconds of nothing. You can hear him breathing. You can hear a chair move. And then he says the sentence that ended his life as he'd known it. I filed a quitclaim on that myself. It's clean. I filed it. And his mother is sitting 8 feet away, 90% through a crossword. And you can hear her ask her son if he wants a sandwich. Here's what he'd done. Years earlier, something had itched at him. Not enough to read the lease. Just enough to want the ground question closed forever. So he had a deed drawn up, the ordinary kind families used to hand property back and forth. It's also, ask any prosecutor, the most common way in America to take a house out from under an aging parent, because all it takes is a signature and a stamp. His mother's land to his company, for $1, and he had her sign it. Except she wasn't there. She was in Cleveland that whole week at her sister's. Grady had her calendar, and the care facility kept a visitor log, and they keep those for a decade. Her signature, on the exact day she was supposedly signing a deed 2 hours away. Richard signed it himself. He'd seen her handwriting his whole life. It's a decent forgery. It isn't a great one. But nobody was ever going to look at it. That was the plan. Nobody looks. Then he had it notarized. And this is the part that would feel cheap in a movie, and it's exactly what happened. The notary was a woman named Beverly Kaminsky, who'd stamped paperwork for that plant for 20 years, and whose license had quietly expired. She never noticed. Nobody ever checks a notary stamp. And the stamp she pressed onto that deed says, right on its face, that she'd been expired for over a year on the day she supposedly stamped it. Thomas Grady found that in about 9 minutes. A magnifying glass and one phone call. 9 minutes. On a document that had sat in a public courthouse, available to anyone in America with $4 and an afternoon for 10 years. The whole thing came apart on a rubber stamp. Eleanor Hartley died in her sleep. Congestive heart failure. Nothing hidden in it. Sometimes a 78-year-old heart stops. But 2 months before, Curtis had come back. He drove down on a Sunday and stood on the porch of the house he'd been banned from for 16 years. He didn't ask for money. He asked if she needed help with the gutters. He came every Sunday for 8 weeks. He did the gutters. He fixed the storm door. They talked about the weather. The aide's notes from 2 days before she died say, Mrs. Hartley in good spirits. Son visited. He never used the key. He knocked. 3 days after she died, 3 grown children sat on one side of a table in a conference room above a hardware store, in dark clothes, checking their phones. They weren't nervous. They'd done the math. The house, maybe $200,000. A small savings account. A car with 140,000 miles on it. 20 minutes, tops. Thomas Grady walked in with a banker's box and a tape recorder. And he didn't read the will. He said one sentence. Your mother asked me to start with this. 31 seconds. A coffee urn. Diane's voice saying a name. And then Richard, for hours after burying his father. She's a line item. Let's just treat her like a line item. Diane started crying at about the 11-second mark. Richard didn't move at all. Grady said he'd expected shouting. There wasn't any. Then he played the 8th tape. Who owns the dirt? I filed a quitclaim on that myself. And then he told Richard Hartley that everything he believed about his own life was wrong, and he opened the box. Walter Boyd's deed, handing 22 acres to his daughter before any of them were born. The lease, with Richard's signature at the bottom, 6 weeks after his father's funeral. The account statement, $518,000 and change. The forged deed with the dead stamp. And a letter offering $6.2 million for 22 acres of flat Ohio ground that Walter Boyd had planted in soybeans because nobody thought much of it. Grady let it sit. Then he explained, in the flat, unhurried voice of a man who spends his life doing easements, that the company didn't own the ground it stood on, never had, and that the paper saying otherwise was a forgery, and the prosecutor already had a copy. Richard said one thing in that entire meeting. He looked up and said, "She didn't know what she was doing. She was 18 out of 30. And Grady said, "Yes, she was." Now be honest with me about that number, because this is where people want this story to be something it isn't. She was not faking. You cannot fake 18 out of 30 in front of a physician for a decade. She was genuinely going. The missed appointments were real. The kettle was real. She was losing pieces of herself, and she knew she was losing them. That's the horror underneath all of this, and no amount of clever lawyering touches it. But she never needed to be sharp at 75. She did all of it at 67, in 4 hours, 3 weeks after her husband's funeral, while she was still entirely herself. She built something that didn't need her. It ran on its own for 11 years and asked her for nothing except that she leave it alone. She didn't outmaneuver her son at 78. She beat him at 67 and then sat in a chair for a decade while they took a house, a car, and a license off a woman who didn't own a single thing they wanted. They spent 10 years capturing an empty room. And she let them, on purpose, because fighting back would have meant lawyers asking questions out loud, and one question would have unwound all of it. And now we're back where we started. Grady put the 9th tape in, and for the first time in 3 days her voice came into that room, and their mother started to speak. He let it run about 10 seconds. Then he stopped it, and before anyone could say anything, he asked them the question, "Do you know when your mother made this? Do any of you know when your mother made this recording?" Richard said something about the last few weeks. A deathbed statement. A dying woman settling her accounts. That's what all 3 of them assumed, and Grady had let them assume it for a reason, and Grady had been waiting 11 years to correct it. 22 days after his father's funeral. She made it before the company existed, before the lease, before the forgery, before the folder, before the doctor, before the courtroom. She sat at that kitchen table at 67 years old and recorded a message to her 3 children, handed it to a lawyer, and then lived 11 more years knowing it was in a drawer above a hardware store. She doesn't sound angry. That's what everyone says. She sounds like a woman reading a grocery list. She starts by telling them she heard them. "I was in the hallway. The door was open. I heard you." Then she explains the land the way you'd explain it to a new hire. "Here's what your grandfather did. Here's what your father forgot to do. Here's what that means." She isn't gloating. She's teaching. 40 years of doing the books, and she still can't stop herself. Then she tells them about the patent. She says, "That was mine. Your father knew it was mine. I let him have it because it was easier, and because I told myself it didn't matter who got the credit as long as the thing got built." And then, without her voice changing, "I was wrong about that. It mattered for 40 years and I never said so. And that's my fault, not yours." That's the only apology on the tape. It's hers, and she's giving it to them. Then she gets to it. The papers are done. The money will sit where it sits. And none of them will ever know, unless she decides to tell them. And she says why. "I'm going to leave the door open." She says, "Richard, you're going to run that company now, and you'll find out fast that it's harder than your father made it look, because it always was. One day you're going to get stuck. And when you do, you're going to sit there and think about who in this world has ever gotten a Hartley unstuck. And you're going to pick up the phone. I'll answer on the first ring." She says, "Diane, you've been angry at me since you were 19 because nobody ever asked you. So I'm asking you. Come and ask me anything, and I'll tell you everything I know, and it's more than you think." She says, "Curtis, there's a key under the flower pot. There has always been a key under the flower pot." And then she says the line that reorganizes everything you've heard for the last hour. "If any one of you knocks, just knocks, all of this goes away. I'll tear it up. I'll sign the ground over for $1 and never say one word about that hallway as long as I live. That's the whole price. Somebody just has to knock." She died 10 years and 4 months later. 3,772 days. Richard never called. Not once did that man ask his mother a question about the business she built with her hands, and he got stuck constantly, and he nearly lost the plant twice, and he took a loan on terms she'd have laughed at. Diane never asked. She came at Christmas. She logged the phone calls into her brother's folder. She said, "Mom, not now." And then she signed the petition. Curtis knocked. 8 weeks out. He didn't know about the tape, the land, the money, any of it. He still didn't know at the funeral. He was 2 years clean, and he wanted to see his mother's face. 10 years and 2 months late. She let him in, made him coffee, and never told him what he'd just done. She just let him do the gutters. So it was never about the money. She wasn't building a weapon. She was building a test, and she spent 11 years hoping to lose it. That machine was never meant to fire. It was meant to sit there, loaded and used, until she died and Grady put it through a shredder and nobody ever knew. All any of them had to do was pick up a telephone. The last thing on the tape, recorded into an empty kitchen when they were all still young enough to fix it. She says, "Richard, you said I was a line item. For seconds of nothing. You're going to find out what the line item was worth." And then, quieter, the last words Eleanor hardly ever said to her children. "I would have given you all of it for a phone call." Richard pled to a felony and got probation because he was in his 50s with no record, and that's how those go. The company had to be sold. A manufacturer that doesn't own its ground isn't a company. It's a lawsuit with a loading dock. 61 of the 96 jobs survived. The land sold for $5.9 million. Richard received $1 and a copy of the recordings. Diane received $1 and a copy of the recordings. Sophie Cole, Diane's daughter, 24 years old, who used to drive over on Tuesdays and ask her grandmother questions about the plant because she thought the answers were interesting, received a trust. Curtis received the house. Just the house. The porch, the flower pot, and the key. Everything else went into a foundation named for Walter and Eleanor Boyd. It has put 141 kids from that county through trade school so far. Not the Hartley Foundation. The Boyd Foundation. She took her name back. And here's what I can't put down. Most inheritances are lost years before anybody dies. Not in a will. Not in a courtroom. In a kitchen, on an ordinary afternoon, when somebody says not now. There's a woman like Eleanor Hartley in a lot of your families, sitting at the edge of a room right now while everyone talks over her head about the car and the house, and whether it's time. She knows something. There's a good chance she built the thing you're standing on. And she is not going to tell you, because nobody asked, and because she was raised not to say. You have to knock. So be honest with me. If your mother made that tape, the one where the whole price is a phone call, one question, one Sunday afternoon, and a ladder and a set of gutters, would you have made it in time? Or would you be sitting in that conference room in a dark suit, checking your phone, waiting to find out how much you'd inherited? I read every comment on these, and the honest ones are the only reason I keep making them. And if you've decided Richard was the villain, listen to Diane's silence again. 11 seconds into that first tape, she's already crying. Ask yourself why. Because she knew. She was as sharp as her mother. She knew exactly what her mother was, and she stood in that room and said nothing. Then said nothing for 11 more years. Then said, "Mom, not now." Richard didn't understand what he had. Diane did. If stories like this stay with you, subscribe, because that's where we're going next.